So I'm going to open up the discussion with Susannah. It's just going to be a conversation between us, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So Susannah, I thought I'd begin with some framing questions. I was thinking about this topic, big questions about big tech. And it seems to me that at the heart of it, there are sort of three framing dualities. And I wanted to run them by you for your reaction and your thoughts. So the first duality, I call it perception versus reality. And big tech is not monolithic. It's not a unified single entity, but it's often perceived as if it is, or spoken as if it is. And I'm even saying it myself as if it is a monolith. So there's the perception and there's the reality, and I wondered what the implications of that might be for policymakers in this space. So, does it create opportunities? Does it create constraints? Does it affect how you have to work or how you have to think about different kinds of solutions?
Should we start there? Well, thanks, Millie, and it's really nice to be here, and hello, everybody. We've got this lovely view of the canal. I'm sorry that you're just having to look at us. That's a great place to start the conversation, and it is certainly something we think about a lot. And, your phrase there, big tech is not a monolith, is something we say a lot in the department, because, when you're thinking about policy, what you're trying to work through is, frankly, what are the ways in which the government could or should intervene? And any policy has to be mindful of the kind of full spectrum of implications. So yes, across big tech, if we were just looking at that, which in brackets we almost never are, only just looking at big tech. But obviously, what does that really mean? Obviously, it's the companies of scale, but even if we were looking at the usual suspects, they do very different things. So certainly our perspective is it absolutely isn't a monolith, and any policy making has to be mindful of that.
So may I just pick that up further?
Yeah.
So agreed it's not a monolith, but how do you navigate the fact that there's both the reality and the perception? So what are the kind of approaches that you need to take to manage both at the same time?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we are mostly trying to make evidence-based policy. So in a sense, the perception doesn't matter as much to us as the reality. But obviously, both inside Whitehall, when we're working with stakeholders, when we're talking to international partners, we're often having that kind of conversation. What are we really trying to do here as policymakers? And in light of that, how do we go about it? Now, sometimes there are things, not necessarily tech-specific, where scale does matter. If you're a competition regulator looking at markets, you may well be thinking about, right, what's the scale and what are its implications? But even there, they will be breaking it down. So I guess our starting point is, what's the reality? And then, we always will be trying to overlay questions of perception, but that isn't where we'll start.
Thanks. I think that's really interesting. And I'm inclined to agree with you. You've got to start with the reality and then kind of consider the perception. But I think for me, sometimes I feel like perception can define your kind of how much room you've got to maneuver. So sometimes for me, it's a kind of you have to start within the bounds of perception, then move to reality, then move back out to perception. But maybe it's different for different.
No, I think that's right. I'd be interested to know in your experience, where you've had those kind of situations.
I think it's more thinking about the kind of public acceptance of certain interventions, and I think that's the case in any policy area. You've got to think about, well, how might this land, or how will it be understood? Because if it's not going to be communicated or understood in ways that allow further engagement with it, it might be better not to make the intervention. I think that's the case for lots of policy areas. I think perhaps what's interesting about data policy is because so much of the territory is new, right? So you're working
Tell me about it.
Yeah, so you've worked with conflicting perceptions, like perceptions that no one can account for and so on. So as well as the evidence base itself being quite new, I think the spectrum of perceptions might be quite new too. So that's...
Yeah, and actually that is an important point, because whilst a lot of things we'll be wrestling with will be inherently subjective, actually we do want to understand different perceptions. And so it isn't the case that, sitting in our office in Whitehall or Manchester or wherever it is, we actually will be able to internalise all of that, which is why when we're making policy, a lot of the process iterates. So on some of our biggest areas of policy at the moment, for example, our online safety bill is in pre-legislative scrutiny. That white paper was published a couple of years ago, and since then there's been a huge amount of engagement with frankly, as many people as we can get engagement with to try and understand their perceptions, I think to exactly your point.
Great, thank you. And you said two other things there just in your responses that I want to pick up on. So I said there were three dualities, and you've kind of preemptively identified two of them. So just on the kind of the perceptions, I was going to call this the Superman versus Forrest Gump duality. Okay. So for me, there's this idea, a lot of the rhetoric around data and the kind of digital technology is built off the back of data, specifically AI. You get these it's potentially going to save the world, it's potentially going to destroy the world. And I think of that as the Superman rhetoric, because, for Superman 1 and 2, he was going to save the world. And I think in Superman 3, actually he's going to destroy the world. And it was very exciting and very frightening. And then, I won't spoil what happens. So that's the kind of the Superman, rhetoric. And then there's Forrest Gump, and he's just an ordinary person just kind of quietly going about his business and saving the world in a very modest, kind of steady, sort of meandering way, right? And it seems to me that a lot of the rhetoric or the perceptions around digital technology is very much in the Superman camp. And I wondered again what effect that might have, if that's correct, what effect that might have on policy making in that space, and whether there's any kind of discussion around kind of digital tech policy that's more in the Forrest Gump space, perhaps.
That is a whole load of things in that set of statements. First thing I feel absolutely obliged to say is get out to the cinema, because within my portfolio is film. And I was lucky enough to go to the Bond film at the weekend, and there's a lot of good cinema at the moment, so I hope you're all getting out and about. But coming back to your question, I think it's inherently the case, isn't it, that any of us, in society today and through the last 18 months of the COVID pandemic, it's been particularly evident, we are living our lives increasingly in a digital way, which means for us as individuals, that brings great benefits. And, UK is high on e-commerce, our digital economy is fairly advanced, but it also brings complexities, in the data space. Obviously, there are many, but also in terms of digital skills, digital inclusion, there's a whole set of things, I think, that matter for us as individuals. And then at the sort of higher level, to go back to your analogy, I think there are some significant questions that policy can answer at a sort of bigger extent. And, COVID again is a good example where, you think about some of the data sets that were used by policymakers to try and inform the interventions at pace. That was very important. And I guess we have found, and interested when we open to questions to hear the audience's views, but we've certainly found that COVID has been a catalyst in the digital economy, and then it means we need to think faster in our policy work to make sure we've internalized some of the direction of travel, which might have speeded up in a way. So it's certainly the case, I think, that policy making needs to do top-down, bottom-up, big scale, small scale, Superman, Forrest Gump, however you want to frame it. And it's just not possible, I think, not to do both. But I don't think that's unique to the digital economy, to digital policy. I think, if we were doing lots of other policy spaces, health or climate, we might find the same sets of issues. But that tension is certainly there, and I think it is really important that we think about both.
I think it's interesting that you say that the same tensions might be in any policy area, and I think I agree with you on that. But I think maybe maybe it's the scrutiny that's being placed on data and digital policy, and maybe the speed is quite heightened.
Yeah.
And I think for me it comes back to the evidence base. The evidence base is smaller because it's a nascent field, so the stakes often feel higher, or that's how it seems to me. And I think that's when you then get the kind of the Superman rhetoric, right? Because there's a space where all sorts of hopes and aspirations can be projected onto it. And I think my motivation in raising that duality was I just wondered whether some of the nuance and the complexity might be lost, with that rhetoric, or maybe the focus on the kind of the big, grand, exciting things might mean that we're missing out on the wins, the kind of the more modest, maybe more kind of like less glamorous, but actually very kind of important because incremental and therefore kind of, making a lasting contribution on other kinds of...
I hope not, is my perspective, because, I think what we're trying to do at the moment in digital and tech policy in the UK, frankly, is sort of think about the full stack of issues. So we've had a lot of activity in my portfolio on telecom security and the kind of hard infrastructure. We're obviously thinking about a whole series of issues in the online safety space. We've had some proposals out for consultation around digital competition. We've got our data reform also in consultation. So there's a whole series of issues there. But if you were to take any one of those and sort of, chop it like a stick of rock, you would see issues that were at the top level, to your analogy, the sort of, what is the potential at society level or from anonymized data sets, really for use in a groundbreaking way, right through to actually for an individual, what does this mean? If I'm a child going onto the internet, what can be done through the online safety bill to protect me. So I think we are trying to do the full spectrum. It's an obvious point, with limited resources, only a certain amount of parliamentary time. In the UK, as a sort of domestic entity, I'm sure we won't do everything, and nor should government do everything. Things in this space need to be in partnership with the private sector. But it's also why the international conversation ends up being important, because, there are some huge questions, almost at a values level, that I think we need to discuss internationally, even when, at a domestic level, we're kind of continuing to try and churn through the changes that we think are important. And I think the other thing is, the UK has got an exciting tech scene. We want to be a great place to start and grow tech business, and a lot of the most exciting ideas, whether they're at the society level or the individual level, will come from the private sector or the third sector. And we want the ecosystem that can generate those exciting ideas in a way, and government shouldn't get in the way of that, in my view.
I'm glad you mentioned both partnership with the private sector, but also civil society, because I want to come back to both those points. But particularly on the point of civil society, I was really pleased to hear that, because sometimes it can be presented as a dichotomy. There's the public sector and the private sector, but civil society is hugely important, hugely influential, source of innovation. As well as a kind of really significant data steward. So I'm really glad that that's kind of on your radar. But I'd like to come back to the point about partnership with industry. The final duality, the one you've been waiting for. So I call this, excitingly, micro versus macro. There you go. Okay. So it's
no film-related analogy.
Well, so this one I was thinking more, it's that kind of, as you're saying, the spectrum of influence, right? And I think that, what you get with big tech, which is not a monolith, is you get a range of activities or engagement, and some of it can be, in the domestic sphere, it can be in someone's personal life, and then you get right through, as you're saying, to the international stage. So that's quite a spectrum of kind of traction, influence, and it's not just in kind of one area, like, kind of entertainment. It's also, say, in economy, it's in the nature of work, it's in trade, it's in all sorts of areas. So again, for a policymaker, what are the implications of that kind of micro-macro spectrum?
Again, many. We could probably talk all week on this, not just for the next half an hour. I mean, I think we're trying to be as clear as we can about what our overall objectives are across the portfolio of sectors in our department that I look after. And I think the government is very clear about the significance of the digital economy to its overall objectives, whether we're thinking about tackling climate change, whether we're thinking about levelling up. And, as I say, society has engaged with digital in a way that we haven't seen before, I think, through the pandemic. We do think it is really important to keep the international conversations going across this agenda, because I think most policymakers are wrestling with the same sets of issues, exactly to your earlier point. The speed of change in the economy and society has been fast. We don't always have the norms that get established over many decades that you do in some other areas. And, certainly, for example, when we were talking to the US government or, the Germans about safety tech or whoever it is, there's a lot of the same questions coming up that I think governments are thinking about, right? As society in some areas automates, as people go online for their healthcare, as children increasingly get all of their information online, what are the policy questions that raises? And we are really, really interested to make sure we're staying close to how other countries are thinking about those things, because, no one country is going to have a monopoly on wisdom. A lot of people are thinking about the same sets of issues. So it's really helpful, I think, to engage and work out, right, where can we get partnerships to amplify? Where can we get partnerships because, in a group you can do more than you can individually. So, yeah, we're very focused on that. And when President Biden came over in the summer as part of the G7, we talked about a US-UK tech partnership, and we're doing work under that across a whole range of streams, from telecoms diversification, AI, some data questions, and so on. So there's a lot that's happening in partnership with other countries at the moment.
Thanks, that's really interesting, and I really want to pick your brains about your international experience, because I think that's really valuable. So just on the kind of, we don't have the norms that have been established over decades, but it seems to me that the previous methods of establishing norms may not be quite how things are going to be done now. So it's not just that the norms aren't there, the traditional methods for establishing norms may not be fit for purpose, right, for expectations now. So there's two kinds of innovation happening at the same time.
I mean, I agree. I think one of the things we've thought a lot about in our policymaking, because when you're, for example, trying to legislate to give powers to a regulator, what you want to do is have as much foresight as possible so that the regulations are future-proofed and that they can, as far as is feasible, anticipate some of the trends. That's difficult when you don't have a huge evidence base. But on the other hand, if you hang back and wait, it may be that norms get established in a way that actually causes policy problems. So there's a balance to be struck. And it is why government tends to consult, to try and get views from as wide a group as possible. And then ultimately, you can always evolve laws and regulations over time. But yeah, I think if you look across our legislative program at the moment, there is a huge amount of it coming out of DCMS in the digital space. And I think it's a bit like, and I haven't done the maths to sort of work out, but if we were to go back, say, 10 or 15 years in climate policy, you probably would have found a lot of legislation happening as they were setting out the parameters for how you tackle that very complex issue of decarbonisation. And sometimes it feels a bit like that. We will probably end up with legislation across telecoms, data, digital, and all of that happening in this parliament, because I think this is the decade where if we were sitting here in 2030, I think we would have seen drastic changes, probably even more than we can anticipate today. So we've kind of got to get on with it.
So you think there's more to come?
For sure. Do you not? You think it's done?
No. I mean, I just think this decade is the one where a lot of the heavy lifting is going to happen.
Yes.
I think.
Yes. What I mean is we've got to, there's always a lead time. So,
right.
For a minister to decide to do something through to that legislation getting on the statute book, through to the regulator having the power that he or she needs, that has several years lead time. So
actual policy.
Yeah, right now in 2021, we need to be on the front foot on a lot of these issues so that by the end of the parliament, these things are, we have some fixed parameters in policy terms.
So laying down the train tracks as the train is moving, yeah.
Always the way.
Yeah, we've got a project at the ODI, it's called Experimentalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and it's exactly this idea that, data policymakers and data practitioners, right, they're going to have to adapt to the changing rate of change, right? And it's the kind of what we're trying to explore is what capacities are needed to work in that more adaptive and experimental way.
Yeah.
And it seems to come down to kind of cultures of failure, what's classed as failure in the first place, and also the extent to which people are empowered or feel confident about learning. And kind of acknowledging that they're learning from something. And it seems to me so tragic that, the mental picture I have is kind of, sort of collective, sort of a community all poised, waiting for someone to be the first mover. And I'm wondering what are the conditions that could support more than one entity, for example, moving together, or almost, as you're saying, in partnership, or maybe what's the role of partnership in kind of mitigating some of the risk or the exposure?
Yeah, I mean, I think we feel fine with being the first mover.
Okay.
So, for example, online safety would be a good example of that. But we're also, to your point, I think, trying to ensure we have got a culture where, for example, regulators might have sandboxes to get experimentation. In policymaking, I agree with you. I think you have to be able to find a way to encourage within obviously some constraints, sensible parameters for experimentation, because it's not possible to get everything right first time. Having said that, it isn't the case that if you're looking after public money, you obviously have to be very careful about how you're doing that. So it slightly depends on what the set of questions are. But to your point, I think I would agree with you. I think it would be a real shame if everybody kind of hung back until they had the perfect polished answer, because society is moving faster than that, I think, and any number of stakeholders that I've spoken to in the last 18 months through COVID have all said they have this feeling of exponential pace of change.
So just two responses to that. Well, so I agree with you when it comes to public money. There's kind of constraints on thinking about experimentation, but it seems to me that it might not be government that needs to do the experimentation, and I'm just wondering about that, coming back to, big questions about big tech.
I mean, I kind of hope that the private sector and third sector are doing plenty of that anyway, provided that works for them. I guess I tend obviously to think in the mindset of a civil servant, but you're absolutely right. And, I think it is the case that a lot of what we want to do is, so coming back to online safety, we want to encourage a greater culture of safety in tech. Now, we will not come up with any of the answers there, but we hope that the private sector will, if you see what I mean. So that's a good example of where, if we can work with the private sector in partnership, hopefully, you get the conditions for success and drive change.
Which brings me to my next point. So, you said that, kind of online safety is an area where UK policymaking, that is being a first mover. But it seems to me that, that an entity can't be the first mover unless others follow, right? You become the first mover when others follow your move. So how would you exercise influence to kind of lead the way in that? Or what are the partnerships that might be needed? Or the kind of changes in the ecosystem to allow that to be a first move that others then follow?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think the answer is, we would like the partnerships to be many and varied. But for example, at this year's G7, there were some online safety principles agreed for the first time. So I think there is you can use the traditional fora, you can have bilateral conversations and agreements. There's a whole series of things we can do at the government level. And later this year, we are having, for the first time, on the back of the G7, something called the Future Tech Forum. And the idea of that is to think about the positive benefits of tech, and specifically around climate, health, and what we're calling the building blocks of tech. And that will be a conversation at the multilateral level with a whole series of countries, but also in partnership with the private sector and civil society. Exactly to your point, because we feel that the nature of these conversations is so fundamental that we want to find as many routes to have them as possible, and almost to kind of stimulate a set of better conversations to drive policymakers where it makes sense to do so, to coordinate or collaborate, because I really agree with you. We should disagree about something.
I'll try to develop a controversial opinion. But the thing is, I think my views are controversial, so I don't know how I feel about it.
Maybe we've both thought about them for too long.
But just on that, on kind of needing to have as many routes in as possible, and just thinking about the international partnerships. I mean, and the fact that this is the time when norms are being established. Again, it seems to me that this might call for, or might invite opportunities for different kinds of partnerships than the UK has had, perhaps in the past.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I mean, I think that we would like to not necessarily be constrained by the past, but look forward and think, right, where are the opportunities? One thing we've done recently is established a Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, which takes some of the UK regulators, so the ICO, the CMA, Ofcom, and the FCA, and is helping them work together on digital issues. Now, they are obviously racing ahead with that, which is great, but what those regulators can do in a way that governments can't do is talk to their international counterparts. So, I think it's useful to have the conversation at lots of different layers, because hopefully it will elicit different outcomes, and, kind of going back to what we were saying, to the answer quicker, particularly where we need to take action, which in itself might have a lead time.
But then how do you, I guess, how do you take diverse communities with you? So the advantage that I see of kind of working within established partnerships or established kind of alliances is that maybe there's more trust in them, from diverse communities or from diverse sectors within the economy. But when those partnerships shift, or when you create new ones where there isn't a history of trust and cooperation, for example, or might be with a stakeholder or community that is seen as a competitor or a threat, or different set of kind of values. How do you bring diverse communities and diverse industries with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point. I mean, I think we are sort of open-minded as to the route, but the point you make is really significant. We have to make sure that, particularly because the digital and tech kind of ecosystem, as we were saying earlier, is not full of, long-established norms or clubs or routes or trade bodies. What we want to do, I think, is just sort of find the way to bring in the greatest number of voices and opinions and viewpoints. And, when you think about something like AI or algorithms, transparency, avoiding bias, it is so significant. So I think it is absolutely vital to do that.
I think it's vital to do that, but these voices might also be in conflict with each other. So for me, there's an interesting tension between bringing voices in, which is the right thing to do, and getting them to align around action or around a position. And I think that's harder and, and may not necessarily be possible. So then the question for me becomes, well, how do you move forward? And does it mean that you wait until you get consensus, or do you move forward, with an imperfect, almost like an imperfect alliance that will change over time? And I don't know the answer. I'm just saying that for me there's a tension there, and for me it's the same tension that you see in human rights rhetoric. They're often presented, these human rights as if you get all these right, then you'll have an ideal political system. But human rights some of them are in conflict with each other, and they can't be reconciled at the same time, right? So for me, that's how do you integrate diverse voices and still unify around action?
Yeah, I think it is inherent to policymaking that you often have a range of views, whatever they are, and it is also the case that sometimes the government or ministers will have to make a choice where there isn't a consensus, and then it comes back to what are their objectives, how are they going to best realise it. But, I think your underlying point is really important, that we need to find ways to ensure we have understood those perspectives, and even if they're not aligned, we can give the best evidence base to ministers on which to make their decisions.
I think that's a really good point. So it's not necessarily about kind of being able to give something to everyone, but about being able to explain to everyone what the decision was and how it was made.
Yeah.
So it's maybe perhaps more about accountability rather than the kind of almost straightforward transactional trading.
That's right.
Or maybe it's about dialogue. So it's, you might not get everything that you want, but at least you've got a place around the table, sort of thing.
I think that's right. And I think, when I used to be in the private sector, you think about a lot of concepts which are well established, like shareholder value and so on. I think in the public sector and in policymaking, it may well be that some of the objectives you're solving for vary depending on what the issue is. So, there's a whole set of, going back to where you started, inherent tensions that we have to wrestle with. But in a way, that's what makes it such a privilege to be involved in some of these questions, because I think we are at a time now in society where, we have got really quite fundamental change happening. Maybe if we were sitting here 100 or 200 years ago, we would have felt the same, but about whatever the challenges of society then were. But today, I think the questions around the digital economy are right at the heart of, what is going to make a massive difference, hopefully, for the better for society.
Oh, that's why I love it. I love the fact that it's uncharted territory, and I think that it's, it's quite exciting to me to be part of building something new, and the fact that there isn't that much of a template, I actually find that quite a privilege and quite a responsibility.
I totally agree. And, when I'm talking to my teams, and if any of them watch this later, thank you to all of you, because, they work incredibly hard wrestling with some of these issues, but the reason they do it, I think, is because they do hope that the policy in the end can make a difference.
But speaking on that point, again, I'm really sorry to be a bit cynical, but it seems to me that government problems only arrive on the desk of government when they can't be solved by the private sector, So government gets the wicked problems, it gets the intractable things, and it gets the things that, it won't get credit for addressing them, because I think that if something could be solved by the free market, then it would be, right? So government gets all the difficult things where it's really hard to prove the effectiveness of what you've done.
Yeah. I think it's inherent, isn't it? The sorts of things we would be looking at are where there is a market failure, or where there's something in society that the market isn't going to do. I don't think it's always the case that it's like that, but that's sort of integral to the nature of it.
Which then leads me to think, well then, if government's going to tackle the intractable and the things that the free market can't do, what should big tech be doing? And you mentioned the Future Tech Forum, which sounds really exciting, and I really liked your focus on the kind of potential benefits of big tech. So climate action, health, and the building blocks of tech. So what should big tech be doing that government can't do?
I think what big tech should be doing is sometimes a question for big tech, rather than for government to sit here and write the to-do list. But if I did have my to-do list, I guess, there are some big questions around digital skills, where we are really keen, I guess, to work with industry in partnership to try and upskill society and particularly through the education system and beyond. That's a big issue. I think, in the COVID pandemic, we worked very closely with tech, not just big tech, to try and get data sets fast to help policy making, to try and make sure people had access to the necessary devices. So there's a whole load of things that I think tech can help with. I don't sit on a Monday morning thinking, what's my to-do list for big tech? Because I'm sure they'll be thinking about that themselves.
I think you're right, yeah.
Maybe we've got some big tech in the audience, I don't know. Perhaps we'll hear from them.
Okay. I do have more questions for you, but I'm conscious of time, so I want to ask just one more question, and
Sure.
I want to make sure that people get a chance in. So what do you think big tech needs from government in order to fulfill its potential for positive impact?
Yeah, I mean, again, that is a big question. One of the things we talk a lot to tech companies, including big tech companies, about at the moment is some of the forthcoming regulation, because I think there's an inevitability that lots of governments, not just ours, will regulate around the tech space. So, I think what's important is, we have understood the way in which they work right through whatever the issue is that they're dealing with. So there's certainly a live conversation on that issue at the moment, whether it's around digital competition or online safety.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I think the way in which the DRCF is working is each of those individual regulators, as you say, has their own set of powers. They have their own communities that they tend to engage with, and they do, I think, also want to engage with diverse groups of society. The DRCF is, in a way, an overview of what are the areas of overlap between those regulators in a digital space, and what are some of the big questions that they know they will have to wrestle with that perhaps they haven't before. So in a sense, yes, absolutely, they should be engaging with civil society, but I wouldn't see it as giving them a specific set of obligations that they don't already have, because I think, to your point, they should already be doing that. I mean, I think on the first one, it isn't the case that things always take a long time. And I think through COVID, we did see some policy interventions that happened very fast for good reason. When things have to go onto the statute book and then, go on with secondary legislation, of course, there is a lead time for it. So I think it slightly depends on what the issue is. But what we try and do on any delivery program, and online safety is the same, is, think, right, where are we trying to get to at the end, and how can we get there as fast as possible? So I think it's one of those questions. It slightly depends on what the issue is, but you're right, it does sometimes take a long time. But often it is because the issue requires a lot of scrutiny and process. So I think it varies. On the second point about disenfranchisement, I think it is a really serious issue. We've got a whole load of different areas of policy, some with us in DCMS, some with other Whitehall departments, just to try and make sure, whether it's digital skills, whether it's the education system, whether it's people having access to devices, we can help. Because I think, to Millie's earlier point, there are some things where government does have to intervene. And if you imagine that society goes increasingly online, I think it is really important that we make sure people are not disenfranchised by that. Your specific question around passports and driving licenses, that doesn't sit with us, it sits with the relevant departments. But I think the point you're making is a bigger one, which is how can we make sure that citizens have access to the services they need? And there is a lot of work on that, some of which sits with the Cabinet Office, but we're closely involved with it, because we do want to make sure that people can engage fast, and also in a way that the data sets from government policy areas can be shared. So in our national data strategy, one of the pillars was around government's use of its own data. And I think that goes to your point. What we want to make sure is, if you've applied for whatever it is, a passport or something, how can we actually use that data better, obviously without compromising privacy or any of the important underlying principles. A personal view, in some ways, I hope innovation is happening faster than regulation. I think it would be a bit odd if it wasn't. And I think if we were, to go back in time or to look at a whole range of different areas, you'd often find that, you have to have the car before you have the speed limit. Having said that, what we want to do, I think, is, to my earlier point, be as far-sighted as we can reasonably be, but we obviously are dependent on evidence base and having the requirement to make the decision. So I think it's a bit of a balance. In the tech space, we really, really want to create the parameters for innovation. We do not want to constrain that. And some of the work we're doing around digital competition will be to sort of look at, is it the case that the big incumbents constrain innovation or not? So I think it needs to be, going back to Millie's point, a healthy tension. But I'm all for innovation. We need that as a society, and we want it. And then, where we can and should, we can also make regulation.
I'd just like to come in on that point. Thank you. So I think for me, there's a difference between just the fact of innovation and the uptake of innovation. And I wonder whether more needs to be done to support the uptake of existing innovations. But also, I think it's important to consider, well, who's participating in innovation and who's benefiting from it. So there's that kind of argument for equity. So it's not just about there being more innovation, but are there more opportunities to participate in innovation from diverse groups, and are the benefits of innovation, kind of benefiting them too?
It's not our perception that big tech is sitting there simply trying to defend its business model. What we see is, tech, broadly defined, doing a lot more things than it used to do. So what we're trying to think about as policymakers is, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? What happens to the market definition? What does it mean for competition? What does it mean for innovation? What does it mean for society? So I guess we're kind of looking down a different end of the telescope. It may well be that some of our policy choices in the end do change the business model, and that has often happened in the past in policymaking in other sectors. So I guess I don't see it exactly as you frame it. In terms of facial recognition, that, I guess, goes to a whole set of issues we're thinking about in terms of how is data used. And what we're trying to do is put in place the conditions so that individuals' privacy is protected. If data is used, there's transparency about how. If it's used based on algorithms, there's transparency and they're not biased. So I can't comment on that specific case, which I don't know, but we're trying to put in place sensible parameters so that as society does increasingly automate in some areas, we don't lose trust for citizens, because I think that's what's so vital. I don't know, Millie, if you have views on that one.
I maybe would just comment that I think a lot of emphasis is placed on the kind of the business models of big tech, but I think that there are opportunities around other ways in which big tech can make constructive contributions, given their scale and given their influence. So thinking about the ways that big tech can support aspects of civic infrastructure, for example. And what motivates me is thinking, well, how do you get the best out of a situation? How do you get the best out of a stakeholder? How do you get the best out of a relationship? So what would be interesting for me is thinking, well, where can big tech lend its expertise and its power and its influence to help develop some of the kind of civic infrastructure that we have in ways that add value to our societies?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, jobs, skills, infrastructure, they all matter. And also, when you look at a company like DeepMind, they're doing really fascinating things and ultimately funded by Google. It's interesting to see the positive benefits that they're bringing forward. So yeah, I think there's a variety of outcomes.